tranquil village of Chipping Hazel, where the green glows under summer's sun, and secrets whisper in the shadows, a stranger's body is found by the duck pond, murdered. Enter Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster with a mind sharper than her knitting needles, unravelling a web of clues. A scrap of blue silk, a hidden mallet, a woman scorned. As love and betrayal collide, the village's calm facade crumbles, revealing a killer hiding in plain sight. Will Miss Marple's quiet wisdom expose the truth before another secret strikes? Chapter 1. The Quiet of Chipping Hazel. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over Chipping Hazel, a village so unassuming that its charm lay in its very ordinariness. Rows of thatched cottages, their gardens bursting with hollyhocks and marigolds, lined the narrow lanes. The church, with its weathered stone tower, stood sentinel over the village green, where a gnarled oak spread its branches, and a duck pond reflected the lazy drift of clouds. It was a place where time seemed to pause, where the most pressing concern was whether Mrs. Price's scones would take first prize at the harvest fair. Miss Jane Marple, a slight, elderly lady with a crown of snowy hair and eyes that gleamed with quiet perception, sat in the garden of Rose Cottage. Her knitting needles moved with the steady rhythm of habit, a soft grey shawl taking shape in her lap. From her wicker chair, she could see the green where children chased a hoop, and Mr. Tuttle, the retired schoolmaster, shuffled along with his terrier. The air carried the scent of cut grass and the faint chime of the church bell slightly off-key, marking the hour. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were not on the scene before her, but on a letter she had received that morning from her nephew, Raymond, full of his usual literary flourishes. She smiled faintly, considering how his London life contrasted with the simplicity of Chipping Hazel. Yet, as she often remarked, human nature was much the same everywhere, whether in a bustling city or a quiet village. Her needles paused as she pondered this, her gaze drifting to the green. It was then that a scream shattered the morning's peace, sharp and raw, slicing through the hum of village life. Miss Marple's hands stilled, the wool slipping from her fingers. She rose, her movements deliberate but swift, and adjusted her straw hat. From her garden gate, she saw a small crowd forming near the duck pond, their voices rising in a discordant chorus. Mrs. Danby, the innkeeper's wife, was wringing her hands, while young Tommy Price, the baker's son, pointed toward the willow tree that drooped over the water's edge. Miss Marple crossed the lane, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones. As she neared the pond, she saw Constable Hargreaves, barely 20 and already out of his depth, waving his arms to keep the onlookers back. "Step away, please," he called, his voice cracking with strain. The villagers parted reluctantly, revealing a sight that made even Miss Marple's steady heart skip a beat. There, half slumped against the pond's muddy bank, lay a man. His tweed jacket, well cut but now sodden, was stained with a dark, ominous patch that spread across his back. His face was turned downward, his hair matted with water and something thicker. One arm was flung out, a gold watch catching the sunlight, its ticking absurdly loud in the sudden hush. The ducks, unperturbed, glided across the pond, their ripples lapping at the man's polished shoes. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her years, took in every detail. The angle of the body, suggesting a fall rather than a collapse. The trampled grass nearby, hinting at a struggle, and a single cigarette butt, still smouldering faintly, half buried in the mud. She noted, too, the absence of any weapon, though the wound on the man's head spoke of violence. Mrs. Price, her face pale beneath her flour-dusted apron, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "It's murder, isn't it, Miss Marple? Right here, in Chipping Hazel!" Her voice trembled, and the word murder spread through the crowd, like a spark through dry grass. Miss Marple patted her hand absently, her expression serene, but her mind racing. Now, Mrs. Price, we mustn't jump to conclusions," she said, though her tone held a quiet certainty that suggested she had already formed her own. She glanced at Constable Hargreaves, who was scribbling in his notebook with a pencil that shook slightly. "Has anyone identified the gentleman?" she asked. "Not yet, ma'am," Hargreaves replied, mopping his brow. "He's not local, that's certain. Looks like a city type, with that watch and all." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze returning to the body. A stranger in Chipping Hazel was rare enough to be noticed, and she had no doubt that the village's keen eyes had already marked him. She thought of the Blue Boar Inn, where visitors often stayed, and of Mrs. Danby's habit of chatting about her guests. There would be answers there, she was sure. As the crowd grew, drawn by curiosity and the promise of gossip, Miss Marple stepped back, her small figure blending into the background. She had no need to push forward. The truth, she knew, lay in the small things, the overlooked, the ordinary, the human. Already her mind was weaving a pattern, though the threads were still loose. A man was dead, and Chipping Hazel, for all its sleepy charm, held the key to why. She turned back toward Rose Cottage, her shawl forgotten on the grass. There was work to be done, and Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming air and unerring instinct, was just the person to do it. Chapter 2. The Stranger Identified. By midday, the village of Chipping Hazel was a hive of hushed voices and furtive glances. The discovery of the body by the duck pond had stirred the air like a sudden gust through a quiet wood, and the villagers, though accustomed to the gentle ebb of daily life, found themselves caught in a current of unease. The green, so lately a place of children's laughter and idle chatter, now bore the weight of something darker, its grass trodden by curious feet and its peace fractured by whispers of murder. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to Rose Cottage after her observations at the pond, sat in her parlour with a cup of tea, her knitting untouched on the table. The morning's events played in her mind like a reel of film, each detail sharp and distinct. The stranger's polished shoes, the cigarette butt smouldering in the mud, the dark stain on his tweed jacket. She knew the village would soon yield its secrets, for Chipping Hazel, like any small community, was a tapestry of interwoven lives where no thread could be pulled without disturbing the whole. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Danby, the innkeeper's wife, her round face flushed and her eyes bright with the importance of her news. Miss Marple welcomed her with a smile, offering a chair and a cup of tea from the pot that always seemed ready in her household. "You've heard, of course, about the dreadful business on the green," Mrs. Danby began, scarcely waiting for the tea to be poured. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but encouraging. "A most shocking affair. Have they learned who the poor man was?" Mrs. Danby leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Leonard Warwick, that's his name. A gentleman from London, staying at the Blue Boar these past 10 days. Not the sort you'd expect to end up like that, mind you. Always so well dressed, with a gold watch, and a manner like he owned half the city." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind their mild expression, noted the tremor in Mrs. Danby's hands as she clutched her teacup. "And what sort of man was he, Mrs. Danby? Did he speak much of his business here?" Not a word, Mrs. Danby said, shaking her head. Kept himself to himself mostly. Always writing letters he was, at the little desk in his room. I'd see him through the door, scribbling away, and he'd post them himself at the village office. He took long walks too, often at dusk, out toward the green or the lane by the church. I thought it odd, a city man wandering like that. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers itching to pick up her knitting but remaining still. And did he have any callers? A man like that, with business in London, might have had visitors. Mrs. Danby's eyes widened. Now you mention it, there was one. A young lady, ever so smart, came to see him 2 days ago. Dressed in a blue silk frock, she was, with a hat to match. They spoke in his room for nigh on an hour, and when she left, her face was like thunder. I heard her say something sharp as she passed the parlour. You'll regret this, Leonard, or some such. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alight. A woman in blue silk, an argument, a man now dead. It was a pattern she had seen before, in the tangled lives of her old village and beyond. Did you catch her name, by chance? She asked. No, miss, Mrs. Danby replied, but she wasn't local. Too polished, if you take my meaning. Not like our girls here. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the cigarette butt by the pond. It had been a Turkish blend, she recalled, not the sort commonly smoked in Chipping Hazel, where pipe tobacco and cheaper brands were the norm. Leonard Warwick, it seemed, was a man of particular tastes, and perhaps particular troubles. And was Mr. Warwick troubled, would you say? She asked gently. Mrs. Danby hesitated, then leaned closer. I'd say he was, though he hid it well. Once, when I brought up his tea, I saw him reading a letter, and his face, well, it was white as a sheet. He crumpled it up quick when he saw me, but I heard him mutter something about debts and no way out. Miss Marple stored this away, her mind weaving connections. Debts, a woman scorned, a stranger in a quiet village, each was a clue, though the picture they formed was still blurred. She thanked Mrs. Danby, who bustled off to spread her tale further, and turned her gaze to the window, where the green lay quiet under the noon sun. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village post office, her steps slow but purposeful. Mr. Gibbs, the postmaster, was sorting letters behind the counter, his spectacles perched on his nose. Good day, Miss Marple, he said, looking up. Terrible business about that man Warwick. Never thought I'd see such a thing here. Nor I, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. I understand he posted letters regularly. Did he send anything yesterday, perhaps? Mr. Gibbs nodded, eager to share. He did indeed. A thick envelope, addressed to a Miss Eleanor Vance in London. Came in just before closing, he did, and paid extra to ensure it went out that day. Seemed in a hurry, if you ask me. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. And did he receive any letters himself? A few, Mr. Gibbs said. One came from London, with a fancy crest on the envelope. He took it and went straight out, looking grim. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back into the sunlight, her mind busy. Eleanor Vance, a name to pursue. The crest suggested business, perhaps legal or financial, and Warwick's grim expression hinted at trouble. She recalled a case from years ago, in another village, where a man's letters had revealed a web of deceit that led to his downfall. People, she thought, were careless with what they wrote, and even more so with what they hid. As she passed the Blue Boar, she caught sight of Constable Hargreaves speaking to a group of villagers, his notebook still in hand. She paused unnoticed and listened. "We're waiting for the inspector from the county," Hargreaves was saying. "They'll want to know about anyone who saw Warwick last night. Mr. Tuttle, you were out with your dog, weren't you?" Old Mr. Tuttle, his terrier at his heels, nodded vigorously. "Aye, near midnight. Saw a figure by the green, hooded-like, moving quick toward the church. Couldn't say if it was Warwick or not. Too dark." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A hooded figure, a letter to Eleanor Vance, a woman in blue silk. The threads were multiplying, but they had not yet formed a pattern. She thought of the pond, the trampled grass, the cigarette butt. Someone had been there with Warwick, someone who had left more than footprints. As she walked back to Rose Cottage, the church bell tolled, its note slightly off. As always, Miss Marple's mind, however, was in perfect tune, sorting and sifting, ready to unravel the truth hidden in Chipping Hazel's quiet heart. Chapter 3. The Clues at the Scene. The afternoon sun hung low over Chipping Hazel, casting long shadows across the village green, where the duck pond now lay cordoned off by a makeshift barrier of rope and stakes. The villagers, though kept at a distance by Constable Hargreaves's earnest efforts, lingered in knots, their voices a low hum of speculation. The air, still warm with the dregs of summer, carried a faint tang of mud and something less tangible, a sense of disruption that clung to the scene like damp to the grass. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat shading her eyes, stood just beyond the rope, her small figure unobtrusive yet alert. She had returned to the green after a light lunch of soup and bread, her curiosity as sharp as the knitting needles now tucked in her bag. The pond, with its willow drooping mournfully, seemed to her not merely a place of tragedy, but a canvas of clues, each detail a stroke in a picture yet to be fully revealed. Inspector Craddock, a lean man with a courteous manner and a mind Miss Marple respected, arrived from the county station in a black police car, its tires crunching on the gravel path. He spotted her at once and approached, tipping his hat with a wry smile. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. You've a way of turning up where mysteries unfold." "Oh, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft as ever. "I'm only an old woman with time on her hands. But one does notice things living in a village like this." Her eyes, bright with quiet intelligence, flicked toward the pond. "Have you learned anything more about poor Mr. Warwick?" Craddock's expression grew serious. "Blunt force trauma to the back of the head, likely delivered with considerable force. The doctor places the time of death around midnight, give or take an hour. No sign of the weapon yet, but we're searching the area. He didn't drown. The water's barely deep enough for that." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the spot where Leonard Warwick's body had lain. The grass was still flattened, marked by the boots of the police and the curious, but her attention was drawn to a patch a few feet away, where the earth was churned as if by a scuffle. She stepped closer, careful not to disturb the scene, and pointed with her umbrella. "Inspector, have you noticed this? The grass here is quite trampled, more than one would expect from a single blow." Craddock crouched, his eyes narrowing. "You're right. Looks like a struggle, or at least some movement before he fell." He straightened, scanning the ground, and his gaze caught on something glinting in a thorn bush near the water's edge. He beckoned a constable, who retrieved a scrap of blue silk, no larger than a handkerchief, its edges frayed, but its colour vivid against the drab foliage. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Blue silk," she murmured. "Not a common sight in Chipping Hazel. Mrs. Danby mentioned a young woman in a blue dress visiting Mr. Warwick. Perhaps this belongs to her." Craddock tucked the silk into an evidence bag, his expression thoughtful. "We'll look into it. Anything else catch your eye, Miss Marple?" She hesitated, then pointed to a faint imprint in the mud, half hidden by a tuft of grass. It was the mark of a heel, narrow and sharply defined, too small for a man's shoe, and unlike the sturdy boots favoured by the village women. "This too," she said. "It's fresh, I should think, given the rain 2 nights ago would have softened the ground." Craddock made a note, his respect for her growing. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. We'll cast it for comparison. Anything else?" She glanced toward the pond, where the cigarette butt she had noticed earlier had been collected by the police. "The cigarette," she said. "Turkish, wasn't it? Not the sort Mr. Tuttle or the vicar smokes. It suggests someone particular. Perhaps someone who was with Mr. Warwick at the time." Craddock nodded, jotting this down. "We're checking for fingerprints, though the damp may have ruined them. I'll have my men ask around about anyone seen smoking such a brand." He paused, then added, "You mentioned Mr. Tuttle earlier, and the Mrs. Lavender. Think they saw anything?" "Oh, I'm sure they did," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but certain. "Mr. Tuttle walks his dog every night, rain or shine, and the Mrs. Lavender, well, their window overlooks the green. They're not ones to miss a thing, though they may not realize what they've seen until prompted." Craddock smiled faintly. "I'll pay them a visit. Care to join me?" Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes twinkling. "Oh no, Inspector. You'll do better without an old woman trailing behind. But do let me know what they say. People often tell more than they mean to, especially when they're flustered." As Craddock moved off to direct his men, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the green. The church tower loomed nearby, its clock notoriously unreliable, often chiming late or not at all. She recalled Mr. Tuttle's mention of a hooded figure near midnight, and her mind turned to the paths that crisscrossed the green, leading to the church, the inn, and the lane beyond. Someone had walked here last night, she thought. Someone who knew the village well enough to slip away unnoticed. Her eyes fell on the gardener's shed, tucked behind the church, its door slightly ajar. It was a place rarely locked, used by Mr. Hodge, the groundskeeper, to store his tools. A memory stirred, a long-ago incident in another village where a garden implement had been the key to a similar crime. She made a mental note to mention it to Craddock later, though she would let him discover it himself. Men she knew preferred to think they had found the clues. As she turned back toward Rose Cottage, a breeze stirred the willow branches, and a duck quacked indignantly from the pond. The green was quiet again, but Miss Marple knew its silence was deceptive. Somewhere in Chipping Hazel, in the ordinary lives of its people, lay the truth about Leonard Warwick's death. A blue silk scrap, a narrow heel mark, a Turkish cigarette. These were the threads, and she would follow them, as she always did, with the patience of one who knew that human nature, however hidden, could never stay buried for long. She adjusted her hat and walked slowly home, her mind already sorting the pieces, fitting them together with the precision of her knitting. The green might be silent, but it had spoken to her, and she was listening. Chapter 4. The Village Whispers. The dusk settled over Chipping Hazel like a soft shawl, muting the greens and golds of the village into shades of grey. The green, now free of its police cordon, had resumed its role as the heart of the village, though an undercurrent of unease lingered. Villagers passed with quickened steps, their glances darting toward the duck pond, where the memory of Leonard Warwick's body seemed to hover like a shadow. In the windows of cottages, curtains twitched, and in the parlours and pubs, the hum of gossip grew louder, weaving a web of half-truths and speculation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage parlour with a cup of tea and her knitting, listened as Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, poured out her anxieties. The room was cosy, its chintz curtains drawn against the evening chill, and a small fire crackled in the grate. Mrs. Clement, a kind but nervous woman, twisted her hands as she spoke. "It's dreadful, Jane, simply dreadful. To think of murder here in our little Chipping Hazel. Who could do such a thing, and why?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a soothing counterpoint to Mrs. Clement's agitation. "People are much the same everywhere, my dear," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I recall a case in another village years ago, a quiet place, not unlike this one. A young man was found dead, and it turned out to be a matter of jealousy, hidden behind the most respectable faces. The truth often lies in what people don't say." Mrs. Clement blinked, her eyes wide. "You think someone here knows something, but we're all such ordinary folk." "Ordinary folk have their secrets," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling faintly. "And secrets have a way of coming out, especially in a village." She had spent the afternoon walking through Chipping Hazel, her small figure blending into the rhythm of the day. At the post office, she had lingered while Mr. Gibbs sorted the evening mail, his chatter as free-flowing as ever. "They're saying Warwick was a gambler," he'd confided, leaning over the counter. "Fled London to dodge his creditors, or so Mrs. Price reckons. She heard it from her cousin, who knows a man in the city." Miss Marple had nodded, unsurprised. Mrs. Price's cousin was a notorious embellisher, but gossip often held a kernel of truth. She thought of the letter Warwick had posted to Eleanor Vance, and the crumpled note Mrs. Danby had seen him read, his face pale with worry. Debts, perhaps, or something more personal? The pieces were there, but the pattern remained elusive. Her walk had taken her past the Mrs. Lavender, the two elderly sisters who lived in a neat cottage overlooking the green. Their window, always open to the villagers' comings and goings, was a better source of information than any newspaper. Miss Marple had paused to admire their roses, knowing full well that a compliment would loosen their tongues. Such a terrible business, she'd said, and the sisters had needed no further prompting. "We saw a motor car, Miss Marple," said Miss Violet Lavender, her thin hands fluttering like moths. "Parked by the church, just after 11 last night. A sleek thing, not like Mr. Hodges' old van. It was gone by morning. Gone in a hurry, too," added Miss Rose, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "We heard the engine roar, didn't we, Violet? Woke the cat, it did." Miss Marple had thanked them, filing away the detail. A motor car was rare in Chipping Hazel, where most travelled by foot or bicycle. Warwick, with his city ways, might have owned one, or perhaps it belonged to his mysterious visitor in blue silk. She made a mental note to ask Inspector Craddock if the police had found tyre marks near the church. Now, in the vicarage, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Tuttle, the retired schoolmaster, who had been summoned by Mrs. Clement to discuss the harvest fair, but was clearly eager to share his own contribution to the village's narrative. "I saw something odd last night, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair with his terrier at his feet. "Near midnight, out with Toby here. A figure in a hooded coat, moving fast across the green toward the church. Couldn't see their face, but they were in a right hurry." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. "How interesting," she said. "Man or woman, would you say?" Mr. Tuttle frowned, scratching his chin. "Hard to tell in the dark. Slim, perhaps, but the coat was loose. Could have been anyone. She nodded, her mind turning to the heel mark by the pond, too narrow for a man's shoe. A hooded coat could hide much: gender, identity, intent. She recalled a long-ago incident in another village where a cloaked figure had been the key to unravelling a theft. People, she thought, often hid behind what they wore, but their actions betrayed them. Mrs. Clement, sensing a lull, pressed for more. "Do you think it was the murderer, Mr. Tuttle? Oh, it's too awful to imagine." Now, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "We mustn't let our imaginations run wild. But it's curious, isn't it, how much a village sees? The green is never truly empty, even at night." She sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving through the day's gleanings. The blue silk scrap, the heel mark, the Turkish cigarette, the motor car, the hooded figure, each was a thread, and Chipping Hazel was the loom. She thought of Leonard Warwick, a man who had come to the village with secrets and left it in silence. His letters, his walks, his visitor in blue, all pointed to a life more tangled than his polished exterior suggested. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return for the fair committee meeting. She stepped into the cool night, the stars sharp above the green. The church tower loomed dark against the sky, its unreliable clock silent for once. She paused, her eyes tracing the path from the pond to the church, where the gardener's shed stood, its door often left ajar. A faint suspicion stirred, but she tucked it away, knowing the truth would emerge in its own time. Back at Rose Cottage, she lit a lamp and resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles filling the quiet. The village whispers were growing louder, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was listening. Somewhere in Chipping Hazel's ordinary lives lay the answer to Warwick's death, and she would find it, as she always did, in the small things that others overlooked. Chapter 5. The Woman in Blue. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Rose Cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor, where Miss Jane Marple sat with her breakfast tray. The village of Chipping Hazel was stirring, its rhythm only slightly altered by the shadow of Leonard Warwick's death. From her window, Miss Marple could see the green, now returned to its usual bustle. Children skipping near the oak, Mr. Hodge clipping the churchyard hedge. But the air held a lingering tension, like a note struck and not yet faded. Her thoughts were on the clues gathered so far. The blue silk scrap, the narrow heel mark, the Turkish cigarette, the motor car seen by the Mrs. Lavender, and Mr. Tuttle's hooded figure. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and the woman in blue silk, mentioned by Mrs. Danby, seemed a central figure. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her knitting basket, turned to the conversation at the Blue Boar Inn, where the mysterious visitor had argued with Warwick, her parting words sharp with anger. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, tucking a basket of apples under her arm, as a pretext for another visit to Mrs. Danby. The Blue Boar, a sturdy building with ivy-clad walls, stood at the edge of the village, its sign creaking faintly in the breeze. Mrs. Danby was in the parlour, polishing glasses, her face lighting up at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call again. Those apples look lovely, straight from your garden, I'll wager." "They are," Miss Marple replied, setting the basket on the counter with a smile. "I thought you might like a few, what with all the upset in the village. Have the police been troubling you much about poor Mr. Warwick?" Mrs. Danby's hands paused on a glass, her expression a mix of pride and nerves at being part of the drama. They've been in and out, asking questions. Inspector Craddock's a gentleman, mind, but he's thorough. Wanted to know all about Mr. Warwick's habits, his letters, his visitor, that young woman in blue. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Yes, you mentioned her before. A blue silk dress, you said. It sounds quite distinctive. Oh, it was, Mrs. Danby said, warming to the topic. A proper city dress, shimmering like the pond in sunlight. She came in a motor car too, parked it right outside. They talked in his room, and I couldn't help but overhear a bit when I passed with the linens. She said something about promises broken and not standing for it. Her voice was sharp, like she was holding back tears. Did Mr. Warwick call her by name? Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. Mrs. Danby frowned, thinking, not that I heard, but he said my dear once, in that smooth way he had. I thought it odd, given how cross she seemed when she left. Slammed the door, she did, and drove off in a huff. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details. A woman in blue silk, a motor car, an argument over broken promises. It aligned with the scrap of silk by the pond and the motor car that Mrs. Lavender had seen. She thanked Mrs. Danby and took her leave, her steps leading her to the village stationer's where Mr. Gibbs might offer another piece of the puzzle. The stationer's shop was a cramped, cheerful place, its shelves lined with paper, pens, and the occasional novel. Mr. Gibbs, peering over his spectacles, greeted her warmly. Miss Marple, come for more notepaper? Or is it the talk of the village that brings you? A little of both, perhaps, she replied, her smile disarming. I understand Mr. Warwick was a frequent customer. Did he buy anything of note? Mr. Gibbs nodded, eager to share. He did indeed. Came in 3 times last week, bought a packet of fine writing paper and envelopes each time. Said he had important correspondence. The last time, the day he died, he bought a single sheet of our best vellum. Said it was for a special letter. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. And did he mention who it was for? He didn't say, but he addressed it himself at the counter. To a Miss Eleanor Vance, in London. Posted it that afternoon with a rush stamp. Seemed anxious about it getting there quick. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Eleanor Vance, the name from the post office, now confirmed. A letter sent in haste, a woman in blue silk, an argument. It was all beginning to weave together, though the pattern was still incomplete. She thanked Mr. Gibbs and stepped back into the sunlight, her thoughts turning to the green, where the clues had first presented themselves. As she passed the church, she noticed Mr. Hodge, the groundskeeper, sweeping leaves near the shed. She paused, her eyes lingering on the door, which hung slightly ajar, as it often did. "Good morning, Mr. Hodge," she called. "You keep the green looking splendid, despite all the commotion." He tipped his cap, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's a sorry business, though. Police were poking around my shed yesterday, looking for who knows what." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "Oh, did they find anything?" "Not that they said," Mr. Hodge replied, leaning on his broom. "I keep my tools tidy, but anyone could slip in there, what with the lock being more for show than use." She nodded, her suspicion about the shed deepening. A heavy tool, perhaps a mallet or spade, could have caused Warwick's fatal wound. She made a mental note to mention it to Inspector Craddock, though she would phrase it as a gentle suggestion, as was her way. Back at Rose Cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed but her mind elsewhere. The woman in blue, Eleanor Vance perhaps, had argued with Warwick, left in anger, and possibly returned under cover of night. The motor car, the silk scrap, the heel mark, all pointed to her presence. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. She recalled a case from years ago, where a young woman's tears had masked a deeper motive, and a man's death had hinged on a single overlooked detail. As the church bell tolled, its note as wayward as ever, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Inspector Craddock. He would be pursuing Eleanor Vance, no doubt, and she trusted his diligence. But she also knew that the truth often lay in the shadows of what people said, in the pauses and glances they thought went unnoticed. The woman in blue was a key, but whether she held the lock or merely pointed to it, Miss Marple was not yet certain. She set her knitting aside and gazed out at the green, where the village carried on, its surface calm, but its depth stirred. The answers were there, in Chipping, Hazel's quiet corners, and she would find them, as she always did, with patience and a keen eye for the human heart. Chapter 6. A London Connection. The morning mist hung low over Chipping Hazel, veiling the village green in a soft grey shroud that muffled the usual sounds of waking life. The church bell, ever erratic, gave a half-hearted chime, and the ducks on the pond glided silently, as if respecting the village's subdued mood. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her small writing desk in Rose Cottage, penned a letter to her nephew Raymond, her neat handwriting pausing only when her thoughts drifted to the puzzle of Leonard Warwick's death. The blue silk scrap, the narrow heel mark, the Turkish cigarette, the motor car, the hooded figure, and now the name Eleanor Vance. These were the threads, and she felt them drawing tighter, though the knot at their centre remained elusive. A knock at the door announced Inspector Craddock, his face weary, but his manner as courteous as ever. Miss Marple welcomed him into the parlour, where a pot of tea and a plate of shortbread awaited, as if she had anticipated his visit. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, pouring him a cup. "You look as though you've had a busy night. Any news from London about Miss Eleanor Vance?" Craddock took the tea with a grateful nod, settling into a chair. "You're uncanny, Miss Marple. I was just coming to tell you about her. Scotland Yard got back to me late last night. Eleanor Vance, 28, worked as a typist at Warwick's firm in London, a brokerage dealing in the property investments. She left her position 3 weeks ago, citing personal reasons. The firm's manager said there were rumours of a falling out with Warwick, though no one knew the details." Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind their mild expression, narrowed slightly. "A falling out, you say? That fits with what Mrs. Danby overheard at the Blue Boar. An argument, words about broken promises. And the letter Warwick posted to her the day he died. Did you learn anything more about that?" Craddock shook his head. "Not yet. The post office confirmed it was delivered to her London address, but we haven't got hold of the contents. Miss Vance is coming to Chipping Hazel this afternoon. Says she wants to assist with the inquiry. I'm not sure I buy it. Her story feels rehearsed, like she's trying to steer the narrative." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. "People often come forward when they're anxious to control what's said. I recall a young woman in another village years ago who offered to help the police after a theft, only to be caught because she couldn't resist correcting a small detail. Be gentle with Miss Vance, Inspector, but watch her closely. Her hands especially. People betray themselves in their gestures." Craddock smiled, accustomed to her insights. "I'll keep that in mind. We're also looking into Warwick's business, dealings. The Yard mentioned his firm was under strain. Some bad investments, whispers of debts. Could be a motive, though it doesn't explain why he ended up here." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window where the mist was lifting, revealing the green in patches. Chipping Hazel is a quiet place, but not so far from London that a man couldn't come to hide or to meet someone. The motor car that Mrs. Lavender saw, the hooded figure Mr. Tuttle mentioned, these suggest someone followed him or was waiting. Craddock jotted a note, then looked up. "You mentioned the gardener's shed yesterday. We gave it a quick look, but found nothing out of place. Why'd you bring it up?" "Oh, just a thought," Miss Marple said, her tone airy. "In a village, sheds are often left unlocked, and tools can be versatile. I once knew a case where a garden spade was used for more than digging. It might be worth another look, Inspector, when you have a moment." He nodded, making another note. "I'll have the lads check it again. Anything else on your mind?" Miss Marple hesitated, then said, "The Turkish cigarette by the pond. Have you asked around about who might smoke such a brand? It's not common here, and Mr. Warwick, I understand, was partial to them." "We're checking," Craddock replied. "The local shops don't stock Turkish brands, but Warwick had a tin of them in his room at the Blue Boar. Could be his, dropped during a struggle, or someone else's, left to mislead us." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "People do leave things behind, don't they? Sometimes by accident, sometimes not. I'll be interested to hear what Miss Vance has to say." Craddock finished his tea and stood, promising to keep her informed. As he left, Miss Marple returned to her letter, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Eleanor Vance, a typist with a grudge, a letter sent in haste, a man with debts and secrets. The threads were weaving closer, but the pattern was still unclear. She thought of the shed, its door ajar, and the heavy tools within. A mallet, perhaps, or a crowbar, could deliver the blow that felled Warwick. And a village shed was just the place to hide such a thing. That afternoon she took her usual walk, pausing by the church to watch Mr. Hodge at work. The shed caught her eye again, its weathered wood blending into the churchyard's shadows. She made no move to approach, knowing Craddock's men would search it properly in time. Instead, she continued to the village hall, where the Harvest Fair Committee was meeting, a convenient excuse to be near when Eleanor Vance arrived. The hall was a bustle of activity, with Mrs. Clement arranging tables and Mr. Tuttle debating the merits of apple versus pumpkin pie. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, her presence barely noticed, and took a seat near the window. From there, she saw a sleek motor car pull up, a match for the one that Mrs. Lavender had described. A young woman stepped out, her navy coat tailored but plain, her face pale and her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her shoes, smart, with a narrow heel that might well match the mark by the pond. Craddock met the woman at the door, his manner polite but firm. Miss Marple couldn't hear their words, but she noted the woman's hands, twisting nervously at her sides, and the quick glances she cast around, as if expecting to be watched. Eleanor Vance, Miss Marple thought, had come to Chipping Hazel with a purpose, but whether it was to confess, deflect, or discover, only time would tell. As the committee meeting droned on, Miss Marple's mind worked, sorting the clues like wool in her basket. The London connection was clear now. Warwick's firm, his debts, his link to Eleanor Vance. But the why of his death lay here, in the village's quiet corners. The shed, the silk, the cigarette, the heel mark, these were the keys, and she was close to turning the lock. She smiled faintly, her eyes on the green, where the truth, as always, waited to be found in the ordinary. Chapter 7. The Truth Unravelled. The village hall of Chipping Hazel, with its polished wooden floor and faded bunting, was an unlikely stage for the unravelling of a murder. Yet it was here that the threads of Leonard Warwick's death began to knot together. The Harvest Fair Committee had dispersed, leaving behind a clutter of teacups and half-finished lists, and the hall now served as a makeshift interview room for Inspector Craddock. Miss Jane Marple, invited by Craddock to observe, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting in her lap, her presence as unassuming as a shadow on the wall. Her eyes, however, missed nothing, particularly the nervous figure of Eleanor Vance, who sat across from Craddock, her navy coat folded neatly beside her. Miss Vance was a pale young woman, her dark hair pinned tightly, her face betraying a strain that no amount of powder could conceal. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, twitched occasionally, and Miss Marple noted the absence of a ring on her finger, a detail that spoke volumes given Mrs. Danby's account of an argument over broken promises. Craddock, his tone polite but probing, began the interview with a question about her connection to Warwick. "We were engaged briefly," Miss Vance said, her voice low but steady. "Leonard, Mr. Warwick, proposed last year, but he broke it off a month ago, saying his business was in trouble. He said he couldn't offer me the life he'd promised." Her lips trembled, but she pressed them together as if to hold back a flood. Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "And did you visit him here in Chipping Hazel, Miss Vance? 2 days before his death, perhaps?" Her eyes flickered, a quick glance toward the window, then back to Craddock. "No, I was in London. I hadn't seen him since he left the city. I only came today because I heard about what happened. I wanted to help." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that seemed to steady the room. She spoke, her voice gentle but piercing. "You loved him, didn't you, Miss Vance? It's hard to let go when promises are broken." Eleanor Vance's composure faltered, her eyes filling with tears. "I did love him," she admitted, her voice breaking. "He promised me a future, a home, everything. Then he threw it all away, said he was in too deep with his debts. I was angry, but I couldn't kill him." Craddock's gaze sharpened. "We found a scrap of blue silk by the pond, Miss Vance. Mrs. Danby at the Blue Boar mentioned a woman in a blue dress visiting Warwick, and the Mrs. Lavender saw a motor car like yours near the church. Can you explain that?" Miss Vance's hands twisted, her knuckles white. "I don't know about any silk. I wasn't here, I swear it." Miss Marple's eyes, soft but unrelenting, fixed on her. "The heel mark by the pond, Miss Vance. It was quite distinctive. Narrow, like the shoes you're wearing now. And the motor car. It was seen leaving in a hurry, just as you left the Blue Boar in a huff after your argument with Mr. Warwick." The room grew still, the only sound the faint creak of the hall's old beams. Miss Vance's face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. "All right," she whispered. "I was here. I came to see him, to beg him to reconsider. We argued by the pond that night. He was cruel, said he'd never loved me, that it was all a mistake. I was furious. I slapped him and left, but he was alive when I drove away, I swear." Craddock's pen paused, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's. She gave a slight nod, encouraging him to press on, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The confession explained the silk, the heel mark, the motor car, but not the murder weapon, nor Mr. Tuttle's hooded figure. She thought of the gardener's shed, mentioned to Craddock earlier, and a suspicion that had been growing in her mind took firmer shape. "Inspector," she said softly, "might we take a walk to the churchyard? There's something I'd like to check, if you don't mind an old woman's whims." Craddock, accustomed to her whims proving anything but, agreed. Leaving Miss Vance in the care of a constable, he and Miss Marple walked to the green, where the church tower cast a long shadow in the fading light. The gardener's shed stood as she remembered, its door ajar, its contents a jumble of tools and sacks. Craddock's men had searched it once, but Miss Marple's instinct, honed by years of noticing the unnoticed, urged a second look. She pointed to a pile of sacks in the corner. "If you wouldn't mind, Inspector, could you have a look under those? People often hide things in plain sight." Craddock, with a constable's help, shifted the sacks, revealing a heavy iron mallet, its handle stained with what looked like dried blood. Nearby, caught in a crack in the floorboards, was a single pearl earring, its lustre unmistakable. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Curious," she murmured. "Miss Vance was wearing pearl earrings today, wasn't she? But only one." Craddock's face hardened. He bagged the mallet and earring, then returned to the hall, where Miss Vance was waiting. When confronted with the earring, her hand flew to her ear, her face paling as she realized one was missing. I don't know how it got there," she stammered. "I must have lost it when I was at the pond." "And the mallet," Craddock pressed, holding up the bagged evidence. "This was hidden in the shed, stained with blood. Care to explain?" Miss Vance's resolve broke, her sobs filling the hall. "I didn't mean to," she cried. "I followed him after our argument, saw him walking to the green. I was so angry. He'd ruined everything. I grabbed the mallet from the shed. It was just there, the door open. I only meant to scare him, but he laughed at me, and I hit him. I didn't know he'd die." Miss Marple watched, her expression one of quiet sadness. She had seen it before, the moment when anger tipped into tragedy, when a heart's hurt became a hand's crime. The hooded figure, she realized, had been Miss Vance, concealing her identity as she fled. The Turkish cigarette, likely Warwick's, had been dropped in the struggle, a red herring that had briefly misled. Craddock signalled for the constable to take Miss Vance into custody, his face grim. As she was led away, still weeping, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and stood. "A sad business," she said softly. "Love and betrayal so often go hand in hand." Craddock nodded, his respect for her evident. "You saw it all, didn't you? The silk, the heel, the shed. How do you do it, Miss Marple?" "Oh, Inspector," she replied, her eyes twinkling faintly. "I only notice what people leave behind. The truth is always there, if you look in the right places." As they left the hall, the green lay quiet under the evening sky, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple walked home, her steps slow but sure, the puzzle of Leonard Warwick's death complete at last. Chapter 8. The Green Restored. The autumn sun rose over Chipping Hazel with a gentle warmth, bathing the village green in a golden light that softened the edges of the past week's grim events. The duck pond sparkled, its surface untroubled by the memory of Leonard Warwick's body, and the ancient oak stood sentinel, as children resumed their games beneath its branches. The church bell, true to form, chimed a few minutes late, its familiar discord a comforting note in the village's returning rhythm. To the casual eye, Chipping Hazel was itself again, its tranquillity restored, but Miss Jane Marple knew that beneath the surface, the village would carry the weight of its secrets for some time. She sat in her parlour at Rose Cottage, her knitting needles moving with their usual steady click, a soft grey shawl growing beneath her deft fingers. The room was filled with the scent of lavender from a bowl on the table, and a fire crackled in the grate, warding off the morning chill. Inspector Craddock, his duties in chipping hazel nearly complete, had called to take his leave, and now sat across from her, sipping tea and looking both relieved and thoughtful. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, setting his cup down with a faint clink. "The silk, the heel mark, the earring, that mallet in the shed, every piece led straight to Eleanor Vance. I'd have got there eventually, but you tied it all together in half the time." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained modest. "Oh, Inspector, you give me too much credit. I only notice the small things, the things people overlook because they seem unimportant. A scrap of silk, a nervous gesture, a tool left out of place. They're like stitches in a pattern, and once you see how they fit, the whole picture emerges." Craddock leaned back, his smile wry. "You make it sound so simple, but I've seen enough to know it's anything but. If you hadn't pointed us to the shed, we might have missed that mallet. And the earring, how did you know to look for it?" "I didn't, not really," she admitted, her needles pausing for a moment. "But I've known women like Miss Vance before. They act on impulse, driven by a heart's hurt, and they leave traces. Small, careless traces. I once knew a girl in another village, much like her, who took a brooch from a rival out of spite. She didn't mean to keep it, but it was found in her drawer, and it told the whole story. People are predictable, Inspector, if you know where to look." Craddock nodded, his respect for her undimmed. "Well, Miss Vance has confessed fully now. She's in custody, and the Yard's looking into Warwick's business dealings to tie up any loose ends. Seems his debts were deeper than we thought. Shady investments, pressure from creditors. He came to Chipping Hazel to lie low, but Miss Vance tracked him down. Her story about the argument and the mallet holds up, though she swears she didn't mean to kill him." Miss Marple's expression softened, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "Poor girl, love can make fools of us all, and betrayal can turn a fool to worse. She thought she could frighten him into keeping his promises, but anger has a way of slipping its leash." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the fire's crackle mingling with the distant sounds of the village. Mrs. Price calling to her son, the clatter of Mr. Hodges' wheelbarrow. Craddock glanced out the window at the green, now free of its grim associations. "It's hard to believe it happened here," he said. "This place looks so peaceful." "It is peaceful," Miss Marple replied, resuming her knitting. "But peace doesn't mean simplicity. Villages like Chipping Hazel have their currents, just as cities do. The difference is, here everyone sees the ripples. Mr. Tuttle's hooded figure, the Mrs. Lavender's motor car, Mrs. Danby's eavesdropping, they all saw something, even if they didn't know what it meant." Craddock chuckled. "You've got the whole village working for you, haven't you? They don't even know they're your eyes and ears." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "People talk, and I listen. That's all it is. And when you listen long enough, you hear the truth, even if it's whispered." He stood adjusting his hat. "Well, I'm off to the station to file my report. I'll tell them at the Yard they owe you a debt, though they'll never believe how you do it. Will you be all right here, Miss Marple? No more murders on the horizon, I hope." She smiled, her needles clicking once more. "I hope not, Inspector, but if there are, I'll be here, with my knitting and my window on the green." As Craddock left, Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, her gaze settling on the village. The green was alive again, with children chasing a ball and Mrs. Clement arranging flowers by the church gate. The pond gleamed, its ducks gliding serenely, and the willow's branches swayed in the breeze. To the untrained eye, it was a picture of innocence, but Miss Marple knew better. She had seen the darkness beneath, the passions and betrayals that could turn a quiet village into a stage for tragedy. She thought of Eleanor Vance, her life now altered by a single, reckless moment, and of Leonard Warwick, whose secrets had led him to a lonely end. The Turkish cigarette, the blue silk, the heel mark, the earring, the mallet, each had played its part, small but vital, in revealing the truth. And the shed, so ordinary, had held the final key just as she'd suspected. It was always the small things, she reflected, that told the story. The church bell tolled, its note still off key, and Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Chipping Hazel was quiet again, its surface calm, but she knew its depths would always hold stories, waiting for someone with the patience to unravel them. And she, with her sharp eyes and quiet ways, would be there, watching, listening, and knitting the truth from the threads of human nature.